Hello, and thank you for watching this video of my talk, Expanding the Pipeline, Further Reflections on ARP. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge, with respect, the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory I live and work here in Victoria, BC, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich people whose historical relationship with the lands continue to this day. This is not an empirical talk. As the title says, it's a reflection and an invitation into a couple of questions I've been wrestling with since I was a graduate student about the academic pipeline, EDI efforts in academia. Um, how do we make personality psych more attractive to underrepresented minority students? And how do we make personality psych a more supportive environment for underrepresented minority students? I'm approaching these questions from my own lens, my own experiences as a Black woman educated in the US and working in Canada. My experiences are not going to be fully reflective of the experiences of everyone who comes from marginalized identity in academia. And I hope that we can dig into these questions further and from more perspectives during the discussion on July 9th. So I attended ARP for the first time in 2013 in Charlotte, North Carolina. This was the summer after I completed my first year of graduate school. It was my second conference. I had gone to SPSP in the winter, and I was excited to experience a smaller conference that was focused on personality research. At some point in the conference, I was in a talk in a room with about 75 other people, and I noticed sitting in front of me an older Black man in the audience. And when I saw him, I realized that I couldn't actually recall seeing another Black person besides he and I in attendance at the conference. And in that moment, I stopped paying attention to the talk and looked around the room to see who all was there. And I could count on one hand the number of other non-white people in that room. And it was a kind of jarring experience, to say the least. I wrote a whole essay about this, for the impression this left on me about the field for the P newsletter titled Reflections on ARP. And this talk is very much a continuation of those thoughts. Um, I wanted more from ARP with regards to diversity then, and I want more from ARP with regards to diversity now. For the most part, I stand behind a lot of what I said in that eight-year-old essay. The next ARP came to me. I was a graduate student at Washington University in St. Louis, and in 2015, the conference was at a hotel just across the park from my campus. It was a 10-minute drive from my apartment, which was great. And it was also about 20 minutes south of Ferguson, Missouri, and in the municipality in St. Louis County, where Michael Brown had been killed by police officer Darren Wilson less than a year before ARP in August of 2014. St. Louis had been a wreck all year. There were protests that were met with tear gases and arrest. The National Guard was called in. Pretty much everything that we saw last summer in the wake of George Floyd's death happened 5 years before, kind of on the streets of St. Louis. But there were no field-wide calls for anti-racist reform after Mike Brown's killing, or after Freddie Gray's death, or Philando Castillo's death, or Sandra Bland's death. Kind of all of them were victims of kind of race-based police violence. And I could not have imagined back in 2015, kind of talking about these events in a public professional forum the way I'm doing now. I didn't know that I could, that there would be space for acknowledging it within my job. So I think this conference is a great step towards diversity and inclusion in our field. So I like to thank Miranda and Joanne for kind of reconciling our past, imagining our future, and towards a more inclusive personality science, the theme of this conference. And also thank, I'm also on the conference committee, so I'd also like to thank Nick and Hunji for their efforts and insights in developing this programming. And I'd also like finally to thank the ARP Exec Board for their support. And thank you to Jordan and Laura for inviting me to be on the symposium. Beyond this conference, I want to acknowledge the efforts that ARP's recent efforts towards diversity and inclusion that have kind of gone into making the Diversity Travel Award in 2019 and partnering with Hogan to create the COVID-19 Emerging Scholar Diversity Award this year. I hope that the efforts to highlight diversity in ARP continues beyond this conference and beyond these kind of tumultuous pandemic years. But it seems like the landscape around diversity and inclusion in ARP is changing for the better. So in the midst of this kind of changing landscape, to kind of return to my main questions of the talk, what can we do to make ARP more attractive to underrepresented minority students? How can we kind of recruit more diverse students into our labs and into our departments? Um, in that essay, I just wanted to return to my younger self assessment that personality psych should be interesting to everyone because everyone has a personality. And I think to further diversify our field, we need to really capitalize on that kind of inherent interest in personality, and widen the pool of undergraduates who might like to pursue a graduate degree in personality psych. Underrepresented minority students need to know that personality psychology is a place for them, is a space for them to kind of pursue their questions, pursue their interests. And if they feel they can belong here, I think they'll be more willing to try it out. And if once they get here, if they feel like they do belong, I think they'll be more willing to stay. So I've got a few suggestions for you to think over for your lab, for your departments, and for ARP as an organization about how can we kind of do better in outreach and recruitment. Um, First, I think it's important that we seek out opportunities to work with underrepresented minority students. There are a few ways that I think you can do this. Some of them require a lot of resources and some just require some of your time. First, if your institution is a part of various pipeline programs aimed at getting students involved in research, you should try and host some of those students in your lab through these programs. For example, the McNair Scholars Program is located throughout the US, and its aim is to get first generation college students with financial need or members of a group that is traditionally underrepresented in graduate education, like involved in research. And they're in conducting research. And the McNair programs differ a little bit university to university, but they typically provide paid summer research program, professional development, faculty mentorship, GRE prep, and opportunities for students to network. McNair is a year-round program, but there are also summer research opportunity programs like the ones organized by the Big Ten Alliance that accomplish similar goals. So I actually participated in the kind of Big Ten's SROP program or SROP at the University of Michigan 10 years ago. I was paid to participate. Basically, I got free housing, room and board, a stipend. I completed my first independent research project, presented my first poster, attended several professional development sessions, and got assistance kind of drafting my research and personal statements, free GRE prep, and fees waived to apply to any Big Ten school. This was a kind of major help to me in the process of applying to graduate school. So if your school is a part of one of these programs and you haven't worked with a student through it, I really encourage you to consider it. Often there's some incentives for faculty members who agree to host a student. If your school doesn't have this, there are other options. SPSP actually has a program called SPUR that matches students from underrepresented minority groups with mentors. This is a virtual program, and SPSP handles most of the infrastructure needs. And I think of this kind of outreach like SPUR, like the summer research programs are particularly useful because many undergraduate psych programs don't have personality psychologists. And so there's not personality research happening in many schools across North America. So participating in a research program that brings students from other colleges and universities into your lab might expose students to personality research who might not otherwise have encountered it. Perhaps building a whole summer program is out of the question for your institution, but maybe you could get departmental or institutional buy-in to host a short-term diversity mentorship program like UBC is holding this summer, or host grad school sneak peeks geared towards underrepresented minority students like the ones that are hosted by Yale and Northwestern. I think these are great opportunities for outreach. Another option is to just help, like if you can't host, help support students' applications to these programs. Maybe they're not going to be in your lab, but help them get into someone's lab. This summer, for example, U of T or University of Toronto is hosting its first summer research opportunity program. And at UVic, our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee really publicized this with our students and then paired students who were interested in applying to this program with faculty members who were willing to help them develop their statements. And out of the 15 students selected to attend, 2 of them came from our department. So I think that made a big difference, that our push kind of made a big difference. Um, so I've been talking about some ways that we can work to do outreach towards underrepresented minority students, but now I want to refocus a little bit. As we bring students into our labs, into our departments, into our universities, into this field, I think we really need to take stock of our environment. Is our lab space, is our department, is our university a safe and welcoming space for underrepresented minority students? Grad school is hard enough without also having to deal with racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, all these things that people can have to struggle with that they shouldn't be an additional barrier as you're completing your degree. I feel like it really doesn't do students any good to bear the brunt of diversifying their departments without support. So I really encourage advisors and mentors, just faculty and departments, peers, to be aware of the way that students' marginalized identities can affect their experiences in grad school. And I think this is particularly important in the mentor relationship. There's been some really interesting research on the way that feedback is given and received in cross-race mentor-mentee relationships that I would encourage people to check out. I feel like they're, in particularly in giving and receiving feedback, there's a lot of space for students to feel like they don't belong, to feel imposter syndrome, to kind of have their self-esteem lowered. And I feel like that's a really a space where we have to be really careful, especially if you're engaging with a student who has a marginalized identity that you don't share. If you're coming from a more dominant culture, that's a place to be really careful. If you supervise a student from a marginalized identity, also, your students should know that you have their back, and you should actually have their back. So if they run into trouble with a colleague of yours, like say someone asks them a question during one of their defenses or during a brown bag that is discriminatory in some way, that, or if your student kind of alerts you that one of your colleagues, either in your department or in the field more broadly, is behaving in a discriminatory way towards your student, please be the kind of advisor that your students actually feel comfortable disclosing that information to, and that you are able to kind of support and advocate for them in the event that this happens. Also, be just aware of things that are going on in the news and how those might affect your students. I'm not saying even if you are kind of a clinician, I know there's a lot of clinical psych folks who do personality research and are here. Even if you have that training, like, I'm not saying be your student's therapist, but do at least like check in and acknowledge that seeing violence towards people who share their identity is draining to them. And also, as you're acknowledging that, try and make space for them to have their feelings, to process kind of when the outside world comes kind of to the forefront of their mind, and maybe is causing them more stress than normal. Even if giving them that space means it takes them a little longer to send you a draft or a little longer to mark some essays. And I also just want to point out that pipeline programs like the ones I described above, which are awesome, but they also work to socialize students to the academy. They try to teach them the norms and the rules of the game of academia in order to help students navigate university spaces that were originally designed to keep many students out. And these programs are really effective. Like, my applications to graduate school were much stronger because I participated in SRP at Michigan. But for our discipline and our profession to become truly more diverse, inclusive, and equitable, there needs to be some growing and changing on the side of the academy as well. a question that I've been considering for myself is what makes a good student? Um, what are the kind of criteria that I'm really keeping in mind in selecting who kind of gets that invitation to come into graduate school and to kind of continue on in the academy, and how might I be more open to different students who maybe kind of who have more room to grow or have perspectives that I wasn't anticipating. So I think this year with COVID, we were in an interesting case where many universities dropped the GRE, and that led to larger and more diverse application pools, because eliminating the cost of GRE and taking also eliminates the cost kind of associated with the GRE. So people don't have to take prep classes. They don't have to send their scores around to all the programs they're applying to. And that really cuts down the cost of applying to grad school and makes it just a more accessible process for students. So with those larger pools, we have an opportunity to recruit a more diverse crop of students. And finally, I'd just like to come back to thinking about ARP as an organization, ARP as a conference, and what we can do to kind of make this space, this conference space, a more diverse and accessible and inclusive space for people of marginalized identities. Being on the conference committee this year, we spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I think that some of the infrastructure that we put into place this year can be easily be built upon and translate into further future conferences. For example, we set up some spaces in GatherTown. This is a plug, by the way, for our social events. We set up some spaces in GatherTown for affinity groups to meet during our social times. And if you would like to connect with other scholars of color, other queer scholars, other first generation scholars, or what have you, we hope that you're able to do so at this conference. I've been involved in similar efforts through SPSP, and those opportunities for connection really improve my sense of belonging in the field. ARP is a much smaller organization than SPSP, and I think perhaps paradoxically, it being smaller makes these connections even more crucial, because the moments where you are the odd person out, I think, seem more substantial and more personal when it looks like everybody else like knows everybody and is well connected. Also, in planning this conference, we've worked really hard to acknowledge the value of diversity and conducting research by giving badges to posters. This is a simple step to include in the review process, and I think demonstrates that these aspects of research are important and valuable. Like it's important and valuable to collect diverse samples. It's important and valuable to use diverse constructs and methodologies. It's important and valuable to acknowledge the constraints on generalizability in your research. And it's also having these invited symposium on specific topics about diversity in our field, I think also highlights the value of these topics. So I hope that from our symposium in particular, that you see it's important and valuable to support, encourage, and acknowledge the work of scholars with marginalized identity and personality psychology. And I think that will altogether will go kind of along, they're small steps, but I think will go a long way in making this discipline more inclusive and kind of plugging some leaks in the pipeline as people feel like they can belong here. So how do we make personality psych more attractive to underrepresented minority students? And how do we make personality psych a more supportive environment for underrepresented minority students? I provided you with some of my own thoughts and experiences, but I'm not an EDI expert. I study personality and relationships. I have a lot to learn around myself, particularly around the experiences of folks with marginalized identities that I don't share. So I look forward to watching the other talks in the symposium and discussing these questions with you further next week on July 9th. Have a good rest of your day.